Very good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in the 10th episode of Wellness Changemakers Leadership Edition. Today is a very special episode for me because our guest today is someone who actually has had a left a major impression on me, I think, especially where I am today. We have today as a guest Dr. Ingo Holzinger, who was my professor back when I was in business school in from 2014 to 2016. So yeah, it's a great day for me, and I kind of have butterflies in my stomach today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ingo.
Thanks, Yash. It's great to see you again.
My pleasure. Just to tell everyone a little more about Ingo, he's a distinguished adjunct professor in the Department of Organization Studies at Schulich School of Business in Toronto, Canada, which is ranked among the top business schools in the world and number one in Canada. He is the director of the strategy field study, which only those at Schulich know what it really is. But let me just suffice to say that this is one study that you have to do, and if you don't pass it, you don't get your degree. So it's a huge deal. And he has been the program director of the Schulich Mini MBA at the Schulich Executive Education Center, runs his own consultancy, co-founder and managing partner of Paradox on Consulting. Ingo has PhD in management from the Wisconsin School of Business, and his expertise includes leadership development, complexity science, organizational change, alternative forms of organizing, management education, and online learning. We are truly honored to have you here. I am so excited to have you here today.
It's great. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here.
Ingo, how have things been at your end, given the pandemic and everything? Hope everything is well at your end.
Pretty well. We're dealing pretty well. I in my profession as an academic, as a professor, I'm glad that I can work from home, and I count myself and my family as one of the more fortunate ones.
I'm glad. I'm really glad to hear that. To start off, I want to introduce people to why we actually have you here today. So, when we joined Schulich, the first introduction we have to the MBA is through you in the launch week. And one of the main signature courses that you run is called Skills for Leadership. Tell us a little bit about what that is all about, this course that you do.
So
Which
Yash,
is
I'd be
trying to make
interested
us.
in your memory of it. I'd be really curious. But the Skills for Leadership course is a course on leadership, but it's a very non-traditional course. It's steeped into or grounded in complexity science, and challenges the students to think a bit differently. I think there are maybe three purposes. The first one is to develop critical thinking skills, which I think are critical in any leader's career. The second one is to simply broaden the perspective, to enable, to facilitate students to think more broadly about the world that they live in, the impact that they have. And thirdly, the course is not really about leadership, but it's about the participants, the students. It's a self-development course, in other words.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, absolutely. I think for us, we learned a lot of leadership skills, certainly. And I think we were introduced to some very unique concepts. And one of those concepts that I want to sort of take up with you is the Black Swan, which is, I think, the most memorable term we remember, apart from reframing, maybe, from your class. And because I'll tell you another thing. So yesterday we had done a poll on LinkedIn, which was, many say that COVID-19 pandemic is a Black Swan event. Do you know what a Black Swan event is? And 62% said no. So if you could tell us a little bit about what is a Black Swan event.
Yeah, so the Black Swan, I'm coming prepared. The Black Swan is a concept developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in the book The Black Swan, published in 2007. And I think that explains some of the popularity of this concept. If you remember 2007, 2008, the financial crisis that really shook the world. And Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote this book. The Black Swan is based on, it's a metaphor. The story behind the Black Swan is that until Willem the Vlaming, a Dutch explorer, set foot in Australia and saw a black swan, to Europeans, swans were white. If it wasn't white, it wasn't a swan. The mental model of swans was swans are white. That mental model was destroyed by the sighting of one black swan, right? So if your theory is swans are white, and if it's not white, it's not a swan, and you see one black swan, it's destroyed. Taleb takes that metaphor of the black swan, takes that story and says, okay, it's not, of course, about a swan, but it's about surprise events. And Taleb describes three characteristics. It's a surprise event that we don't predict, that we can't forecast. It has an extreme impact that can be positive or negative. And thirdly, and maybe most interestingly, in retrospect, we as humans are able to make sense of it. So we can't predict the event, but in retrospect, we can make sense of it. If you take the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, for example, most of us did not expect it. A lot of people lost money. And a financial bubble, by definition, is a surprise event to most. Otherwise, the bubble wouldn't exist. But afterwards, we had lots of theories that made sense of the event. And so we patted ourselves on the shoulder. Oh, we now get it. It won't happen again. We will never let this happen again. And therein lies a danger, in that we say, okay, that one financial crisis won't happen again, but it wouldn't happen again anyway. But does that really help us, that insight, to predict the next black swan? Probably not. So that is the concept of the black swan. Surprise events that have a large impact, and we as humans have the ability to make sense after it, but can't predict it ahead of time.
I think that's so well explained. I think that would have really cleared everyone's doubts about what it really is. So coming to the current situation, this pandemic that we have been in for over a year now, almost 1.5 years. If I look at it from a leadership perspective, from the perspective of leaders, from their point of view, would you say that this has been a black swan?
The black swan is in the eye of the beholder. What is a black swan to one person may not be a black swan to another observer. So that's important to realize. I think for most of us, it clearly was a surprise event. If we had chatted, a year and a half ago, would I have predicted that a pandemic is coming? No, probably not. Has it had an effect? And I understand. I'm talking to you. You're sitting in India. Many in our audience are from India, and India is hit hard by the pandemic. So did it have effects? Sure, the effects were large, right? Do we now have theories of all this all happened? Well, they're emerging, I would say. Our sense making of the pandemic is emerging. So in that sense, in sort of the bigger sense, maybe the pandemic is a black swan. Many call it actually the black elephant. A combination of the black swan and the elephant in the room. Because, we kind of knew that pandemics happen, right? It was before your time, but when I moved to Toronto in 2003, that was the year when SARS happened, right? So, and SARS, of course, is a coronavirus, just not as dangerous as the current one. So, and we had talks by Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is not even the expert. With lots of experts talking about coming pandemics and viruses. So we kind of knew that it was happening. It was the elephant in the room, and yet we were not prepared. All right. So black elephant, I think, is actually a nice way of putting it.
Do you see black elephant being introduced into skills for leadership now in the future?
It has, in some extent. I have developed a few. See, I was affected by this too. I have developed some online modules now for the course because we teach remotely currently, and the black elephant is mentioned there as a, sort of a side story.
Wow, thank you so much. So yes, black swans, they will happen. You can't predict them. Maybe you can sort of see that it may have happened, like it may come, like you mentioned, that there have been pandemics in the past. How do we really prepare us? Is it possible to prepare ourselves for it at all?
So I think preparation for a black swan means maybe something different than we typically understand in terms of preparation. We can't predict them. We can't. So these are low probability events, but if they hit hard, right? And if we were to try, if we even attempted to prepare for every low probability event, it's impossible. Just think about that, right? We can't prepare for everything. So Taleb would argue that trying to do risk management to forecast, to predict the next black swan is not something that we should do. So what are the implications then? If we live in an inherently uncertain world, maybe we have to give up some of our need to control and embrace uncertainty a bit more. Maybe the way to prepare for black swan events or for uncertainty in general is to develop skills that make us more adaptable, that make us more resilient, rather than try to predict and to control a world that is largely not controllable. So I would emphasize adaptability and resilience, and we have of course built systems that make it very hard to be adaptable and resilient because we love certainty and control so much as human beings that we have built systems, organizations, businesses that aim for efficiency, for control. The more you can control your cost, the more you can control your supply chain, the leaner it is, the better. And I think that may be the big lesson that comes out of the pandemic, that under certain circumstances, that is completely correct. Under certain circumstances, when things are more predictable, efficiency and leanness are great. If things are not so predictable, it may backfire. So context becomes really important. I don't know, Suyash, whether you remember that we talked in the course also about context awareness, that in order to be an effective leader, in order to be an effective person, we need to understand our context. So currently the context is the pandemic for most of us.
Absolutely. And, we bring in the whole, there's so much complexity and so much uncertainty. What can leaders do then? Because generally, I think, like you said, as humans are innate, we innately want to control. And clearly, it can be very unsettling to be in this kind of a situation. What makes a leader who can be ready for such a complex situation?
Yeah, I'm just taking some notes here so I don't forget anything. So I would think, so on top of it, I think there are three key skills. One is context awareness, understanding the context that we are in. And so Yash, if you remember, and maybe some of our audience who have taken the course may remember, that I make an effort to delineate simple, complicated, complex. And in terms of context awareness, what kind of context are we in? Are we in a simple or complicated context, or clear and complicated? Is the world ordered? Is the world around us ordered? Then we can deal with that very differently. If the world around us is ordered, we can rely on experts. We can maybe rely on best or good practices that have already established. If we deal with complexity, and complexity is inherently unpredictable, the black swan would be an example of a complex event. If that is true, maybe we have to give up of that control. So the first skill that I think leaders, or we as professionals, as individuals, need to develop is a context awareness. What is the context like? without making assumptions. The second one is self-awareness, because we interact with our context. So Yash, you said, we aim for control, or we desire control. Well, if that is a personal desire that I have, if I get anxious, if I'm not in control, I need to understand that and develop ways to deal with that anxiety, to deal with that need to create control. And thirdly, there needs to be a shift to relationships. Relationships are the important unit. It's not just individual points, individual pieces that matter in complexity, but relationships often determine the outcome, or the emergence of what happens in these situations. So if we can become better at reading the context, is it simple? Is it complicated? Is it complex? Is it maybe chaotic even, which is way out there? How do I interact with that context? Am I comfortable being in a complex situation? Do I desire control and order? And how do we manage the relationships? And that, of course, is difficult and complex in itself. But to understand that it's not the individual that makes a difference, but the relationship that we develop with others.
I love the point about relationships that you mentioned, because I think that also ties in with the theme that we've had for this whole series till now, which is empathy. This particular Black Swan has really demonstrated how absolutely essential it is for leaders to be empathetic in their approach, whether it is towards their clients, customers, or their employees as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it relates to the relationship. You may remember this example that I used. Dealing with a complex context is like raising a child, right? And each child is different. And so to develop the skills to understand the child, the relationship I have with the child, myself. Actually, this is maybe a nice situation, raising a child, to get to the three. So what is the context here? The context is that I may have a crying child who's upset about something, right? And it's escalating, and I don't quite understand what's happening. So there is some complexity here. I need to aware, how does this make me feel? Maybe the crying child makes me anxious, and I get more agitated. Right? And that makes it difficult for me to interact with the child. And the relationship that I have with that child in the end determines whether we move on successfully forward, or whether this escalates into something that can end up catastrophic, right? And I use the example, based on the work by my late colleague Brenda Zimmerman. I use this example of raising a child, or if you don't have children, substituted by having a romantic relationship. Same thing. It's complex. It's inherently complex. What works one day doesn't work the other day. And so yes, you mentioned empathy. So the empathy that I can understand how that other person feels, how that child, how that romantic partner feels at the moment, helps me be more effective in managing, or in moving the relationship forward, if that makes sense. And of course, that applies also in our work organizations, right? So if a leader can become more of a parent, and I don't mean this paternalistic that I have to be the big parent who takes care of it, but a partner in a relationship, rather than a leader who leads top down, becomes important, because we all deal different with the pandemic. I told you earlier that I've been fortunate. I sit here in this chair every day, and I'm tired of it, and I would like to be back at school in the classroom, but I can do my work by sitting in this chair and being in this office. So I'm fortunate. Others are less fortunate. I think we need to understand that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I like that we have already started receiving questions for Ingo, and we will be coming to those questions. Please do share them in the comments. I wanted to ask you this, that in your observation, where might leaders be going wrong in this situation?
Yeah. So for leaders, it's tough, right? Because they often have reached their positions by being exceptional, by being different, by taking charge. If you think of leadership, and if you look inside and think, okay, what does leadership mean? You probably think of a person at the top who knows more than others, who can delegate, who can empower others, who can maybe motivate others. But it's that one person who is responsible in a way, right? Who is accountable for where the organization is going. And that image of leadership, I think, hurts us in dealing with complexity, because in complexity, where things change all the time, where we have no best or good practices, where we cannot rely on past data, how do we know that we're right? How do we know that the leader is right? So drawing on multiple perspectives, working with others in the organization, getting multiple inputs. David Snowden, who's one of my personal heroes, but also one of the thought leaders, although I don't like that term a whole lot, in this field of anthro-complexity, complexity in organizations and social systems, talks about distributed sense making. What are all the voices around us? Because together we can probably make better sense of the current situation than one person alone. And so I think that's where leaders go wrong. When in crisis, as a leader, we feel we have to take on more responsibility. We have to come up with the right solution. Just that no solution may exist right now. And so instead of reaching out and enabling others to contribute and listening to others, we feel forced to make these decisions. And I think that becomes really problematic with leaders when they face complexity. Hope this makes sense.
It does, and I think it really goes back to that thing that you said again, that it's the relationships that you need to rely on here, probably, rather than you having to just firefight everything. You need to use those relationships that you build within the organization to be able to get through this together.
And in terms of self-awareness, I think humility plays a huge role, right? That to understand that I don't have the solution in this situation. I don't have it. Maybe someone else had it. Maybe the solution is in the crowd, in us, but not in one person. All right, and that's where relationships become really important. And relationship, I don't mean only Suyash and I get along very well. It's a relationship, but that we utilize this relationship to come up with something better. That we can share ideas, build on ideas, because none of us individuals actually have the solution, or even the way forward.
Yeah. Would you have any, again, in your observation, an example of anything that comes to mind, which would be like, this was the perfect example of how things should be dealt with?
Oh, it's so context dependent. That's a tough question. That's a tough question to answer. I give you one example out of my own experience that I'm quite proud of. I don't know whether there are any in the audience, whether there are any students who took my course last winter when the pandemic hit. So it was clear that something was happening already, but it was not quite clear what the implications would be. This was in Toronto, early March. And before anything shut down, I figured, okay, I think there's at least a possibility, and I have another example later. There is at least a possibility that universities might shut down. So why don't we prepare for that? In our next class, we teach online. We'll try it out. It's a safe to fail experiment. And that's an important important concept when dealing with complexity. How can we experiment? Because through experimentation, we learn something, right? We don't know the answer, but maybe through experimentation, we learn something. And so how can we conduct experiments or use probes that are safe to fail? If it doesn't work, oh, well, we have lost one class. So I had announced to my class that, hey, our next class, we will teach online just to present, just to practice. And by the time that class rolled around, the university was closed. So what started as a safe-to-fail experiment had become the new reality. Another example that's not as self-indulgent as the last one is Shopify here in Canada. You know, a Canadian company, Shopify, powers many of the sort of a competitor for those of you who don't know Shopify, somewhat of a competitor to Amazon, though they don't run their own site. They just empower other businesses to run their online sites. And what Shopify did was, and I heard this in a podcast with Toby Lütke, the founder and CEO of Shopify. They were to switch offices. They're in Ottawa, Canada's capital. They are located in Ottawa, and they were going to switch from a smaller building to a bigger building because they were expanding, and it looked like the new building may not be ready in time, but they had already canceled their lease on the old building. And so what do we do? So Shopify decided that, you know what, we don't know what will happen. Maybe it will work out, maybe not. Let's not wait. Let's all go home and work from home and see how it works. Do you think that Shopify was pretty well prepared for the pandemic because they ran that safe-to-fail experiment? I think that is a way to think about this. Where can we experiment to learn something to make ourselves more adaptable for whatever event might happen in the future?
In a way, just that ability, or rather that them wanting to experiment, was their way of preparing themselves for this black swan.
That's
right?
it. You know, Shopify could have said, well, that would be really inefficient. Let's just expand our lease, or let's see what is possible, because we don't want to take risks. We don't want to have additional costs because we don't know what happens. Maybe they had to pay for computer equipment to empower the employees to work from home and such. Instead, the CEO said, hey, this is an opportunity. Why don't we just do it and see what happens? And I think that kind of mindset helps a great deal because it creates mental flexibility, but it also creates different options. For a company like Shopify, it's pretty easy then to say, oh, there's not just one way to do it. We don't have to invest in this one way forward, but there are multiple ways. And by experimenting, you create that mindset, but you also create options, real options.
Absolutely, it gives you a plan B.
Yeah, totally. And C and X, many.
100%. We are getting some. I just want to show this because this is someone from my cohort, which is nice to see. Ingo and Suyash. Hey, Lindsay, thank you for attending.
Hey, Lindsay.
I do have a question here from, again, one of our ex-students who was in the winter cohort back then. Anant has asked that, how should one reframe their individual experiences of the pandemic to look forward? Do you see any silver linings embedded in the very disruption caused by it?
Yeah. When you talk about individual experience, there are individual experiences, and I don't know what your individual experience was. Some of them are, more dramatic or have had larger impacts than others. For myself, I've been safe. My family's been safe. I've been working from home. For me, I've taken this as a time to experiment. So I developed online modules. If you had asked me whether a course like Skills for Leadership, which is very interactive, whether that would be a good course to teach online, I would have told you, no, it's not.
Yeah.
But it happened. So what do? So I developed online modules. There are 5 or 6 online modules that I share with the students that they can do on their own time, that talk about some of the things we talk about here. So that is, for me, it was a time to innovate, really, and to challenge my assumptions about education and how I teach and all that. But that was my experience. I've been healthy, I've been safe, right? And I hope that you, Anand, or others are in a situation where you can take a step back and reflect what actually happened here, and how did it affect me? How did I affect my environment? And what can I take away from that? Because I think in these and I have to be careful what I say here, because there were a lot of casualties, people who are not with us anymore, and they can't learn, and their families have lost loved ones, and reflection is not the answer. So I'm very, very aware of that. But for those of us who take this as an event that and when we go on and want to grow from it, then I believe reflecting and to see, okay, what happened here? Unexpected events can happen again. How do I prepare myself for them? Not for the specific event, but how do I prepare myself? How can I better embrace uncertainty? How can I become more flexible? How can I become more adaptable? I think in these crisis situations, there's often, not always, there's often a glimmer of hope and opportunity as well. What worked, for example? What worked? What worked really well? How did communities get together? What were the positive things that we maybe can take forward from that? And again, it depends on your experience and your community. But I would hope that there are some positive things to take forward as well.
And the one thing the pandemic has given is time and opportunity to really self-reflect.
Yeah, I sit here a lot by myself, yes. Or interrupted by my 5-year-old.
Just to remind everyone, we are here for another half an hour. Please do share any questions you have for Ingo in the comments section, and we will take them up. We did receive some questions while people were registering for this session as well. One question that came to us was, how do you build a high-performing culture in these times of virtual working?
Wow. It is so much challenging, right? It is. I had a conversation with a recent MBA graduate who talked about their strategy field study. So yes, you referred to it, to the 601, and the team that he worked with, and how tough it was to just create the collaboration. And to create the team norms and the accountability and all that. It is tough. I guess the one advice that I would have is to take the time to continue to invest in relationships. And even if it, and he and I talked about this, even if it is an online escape room, that you and your team, it's harder to do with a large organization, but you and your team maybe do something that is not work related to keep the relationship going. Because what we're missing out on is not the work so much, but the social relationships, right? That we, and so you and I talked about this before the session started, that we miss being around other people in the office, being around, the chat about the last cricket game or what have you, right? That is missing. And so how can we create the time to do that with our teams, to continue to invest in the relationships that I think are in most contexts anyway, are fundamental for high performance culture.
Thank you so much for that. And this person again had a follow-up question, which was that how do you demonstrate to leaders the need to create such a work culture? What is the journey between convincing them to executing it?
It's also a tough question. It also depends on the context, eh? So it's a question actually that I get quite a bit when I talk about leadership and complexity. How do you get others on board? How do you convince a leader? And I assume that that person asking the question talked about sort of a hierarchical situation where the leader is the one at the top and has more authority. So how do you convince them? Well, you two things come to mind. I'm sure there are more, but two things come to mind. What is the business case to be made here, right? Is there a business case to be made to invest in these relationships? And I think a lot of organizations actually have done that, right? Where they have, my wife's organization, for example, they have a Friday checkout where all it's a small organization, I think maybe 20 or 30 people, but all of them go online on every Friday for an hour and a half and do something social. And one of them prepares, there may be riddles, or they may be storytelling or something, just to keep the relationships going. And the business case, what I mean by business cases, what are the benefits? And maybe if your leader, if your boss is not inclined to invest in that, maybe you can make the argument that, hey, it actually helps the business if we do that. The other, so that's one thing, the business case. The other thing is to be as a the question was asked about the leader, so I'm turning that around, as a follower, to be empathetic to the needs of the leader as well. And maybe you can connect some of the things that I've talked about, relationship building and such. Maybe you can maybe the leader needs that too, right? And maybe you can make a more personal pitch. I hope that provides some answers to that question.
I think it certainly does, and I really like what you said near the end there, because we must not forget that leaders are humans too, and we what we expect from them, sometimes I think we need to go back and give it to them as well. We treat them in that certain way, maybe compassion, empathy.
I very much think so. It connects to what I said earlier, that as leaders we're in a tough spot, because there are so, not only the expectation, not on our own history of success and how we measure ourselves and being in control, but others measure us like that too, right? So imagine it would be very hard for someone who is in a leadership position to suddenly let go of control when others look to that person in crisis, right? In a crisis situation, when other people look at that person as, give us the answers. And for that leader to say, I don't have the answers, let's work together. It's a really, really tough spot, not just for that person, but also based on the expectations that others have of that person. So yes, leaders are people.
Absolutely. I have a question, which again I had received from someone from York U actually, which was that there are professionals who don't really understand or aren't aware of organizational development. It all feels like beautiful words and concepts. How can we distill them down to actionables?
Well, I'm sure the audience is getting tired of this, and I am too. It's so context dependent. I can't, here, if it were as simple as, here are the 3 steps, 1, 2, 3, and you have it done, then it's a simple problem. If it's a simple problem, we wouldn't be talking here about it because it's irrelevant. Would have all solved it. The question is a great question, but it comes with an assumption that there is one way of doing it, right? And it so much depends on the history of that organization, of the norms that already exist, and so on. So I don't feel comfortable giving an answer, when the situations that we're in are all different in that context.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. Again, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are in the last 20 minutes of this session. If you have any questions at all, this is really an amazing opportunity for you to ask Professor Ingo Holzinger and get the answers. I wanted to ask you, in terms of when we talked about skills for leadership, we did talk about what are the skills required to be able to deal with a complex situation. Do you also see that there are certain skills which were considered to be a must for us for being a leader, which might not be so relevant anymore in the coming times?
Context. So overall, I see the world becoming more complex, and that's why the course that we took together, Suyash, focused on developing skills specifically for dealing with complexity, right? Does that mean that all the other stuff is irrelevant? I don't think so. One metaphor or example that I like to use is this distinction between a symphony orchestra and a jazz band. And while I would argue that, and I think both are fantastic examples of leadership, but they're very different and they work well in different contexts. The jazz band works in terms of being really innovative. Every night something different happens. They improvise. They have to listen to each other. They have to really deeply collaborate to create every night something new. The symphony is and I don't do it justice. I'm sorry if I offend any fans of symphonic music, but a symphony orchestra, in essence, metaphorically, the goal is to be as close to perfection every night, right? So while I believe that the world is becoming more complex and that jazz may become a more prevalent metaphor of leadership, do I think that the skills that a conductor of a symphony orchestra possesses are not relevant anymore? I don't think so. I don't think that these skills become irrelevant. It's just that we may have to supplement our existing skills, our maybe the more traditional leadership skills of being in charge, having an idea of where we are going, having a clear direction, with skills that of more flexibility, more listening, more interactivity. So we have to still be a conductor and become a jazz musician at the same time, which of course is incredibly. I'm asking a lot of leaders by saying that.
Well, it's a part and parcel of being a leader, I guess. So do you also see that, given the context of, say, whatever used to be taught in skills for leadership, given the context of the new normal from which is coming, the new world, the world that is going to be that's going to emerge from this pandemic is going to be somewhat affected, and there will be a permanent change. Do you see that there will be new additions to the skills that are being taught to future leaders?
Yeah, so managing a remote workforce will be one of them, right? And it's a tough one. I think we do have some knowledge of what this takes, but over the past year and a half, we have learned a great deal, and we're still learning. All right, so how do you, going back to the earlier question, how do you build a culture? How do you build accountability? How do you build relationships? in a remote context will be one skill that organizations and leaders need to develop. I believe that I don't know whether this will be our last pandemic or not, but I'm fairly certain it will not be our last surprise event. Things will happen that we don't predict. So I hope that leaders, and when I say leaders, I'm not just talking about CEOs or vice presidents. I'm actually talking about all of us, people who want to make a difference. I hope that one thing we are taking away from this is sort of this awareness that, hey, I don't have control. And what does that mean, not having control? What does that mean in how I relate to others? That we develop a learning perspective. And by learning, I don't mean you're adding one certificate after the other, but being curious, looking out into different fields, maybe learning something from them, that we become more adaptable and flexible. So one quote I think that may be a good fit here is from one of my other heroes, Jennifer Garvey Berger, who said, as leaders, we don't have to be superhuman, but super human. Become more human.
Absolutely love that. Let me take it a step further. With this online workforce, how does the way you interact with your workforce, you direct them and you assess them, how does that change?
I think making time to still so you asked interact and assess, and I think both are again context dependent, but I owe you an answer on that one. So I will not use a cop out. Although it really isn't a cop out. I do believe that context is incredibly important. The interaction. How do you make time? How do you? So we had in the pandemic, we at Schulich had a leadership change. Our dean of 32 years or 33 years stepped down. And we currently have an interim dean who stepped into this position, into a situation that was outside control. And for universities, the pandemic was a big threat because we initially thought, oh my goodness, we will lose all our students. Who will want to do higher education in this situation? So the interim dean stepped into this, and one thing I think that he did really, really well was that he opened up conversations. He created transparency with town halls. One thing is information flow, because as a leader, typically more in terms of what is going on, what is the larger context, what about layoffs? What about this is what people worry about, right? Layoffs, budget cuts, and so on, and that you share honestly. I think honesty, transparency is important in that context. Share what is going on, and also so that the top-down information sharing, but also start listening. Start listening to the perspectives that you understand, that you can actually develop and show the empathy that's important. So in terms of interactions, how do you create that? Do you have town halls? Do you have small group meetings? It is and when I say that, I'm very aware that that weighs heavily on a leader. It's a huge time investment. It's a huge emotional investment. Right? How do you manage yourself then? So much about the relationship and the interaction with employees, with the workforce. How do you assess? That is even more context dependent. I wish we didn't. So a Freudian slip maybe here. I wish we trusted the people we work with. I wish we were confident that we made the decision to hire someone because we trust them, at least to an extent, that they get their work done. Because right now, we don't see what they do, right? We can't look over the shoulder, which we probably shouldn't do anyway. So they sit at home, they work remotely, and to trust. And I think that's actually one of the good things that may be developing out of this pandemic, that we start trusting, hey, our business didn't fall apart. We are still getting work done. That we trust people that they actually want to do a good job. And that the question then becomes, okay, as a leader, how can I enable, how can I help others get their job done rather than measuring performance? I mean, at the end of the day, we hopefully see how our organization is doing, and maybe that's where transparency comes in as well. That we maybe share performance data, right? But we need to be aware of this context. People are sitting at home. Let's just assume, until it fails, let's just assume that they want to do a good job. How can I help them?
Absolutely. I have, I think we are nearing the end of this session. I wanted to ask you something related to the triple bottom line, which was another concept that we did learn in your course, which was for the viewers, triple bottom line is the three things that companies should focus on: social, environmental, and financial. Ingo, do you think that even the triple bottom line might change? Maybe there'll be more factors added now in the coming days, given the context of where we are now and the coming times?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether the social gets more attention, right? So I think the triple bottom line, or now it's, we often refer to it as ESG. I think it's almost unavoidable for companies, at least in sort of the Western context. I don't know. I don't know where exactly India, for example, is at this, but a company that does not think about what is going on socially and think about what is going on environmentally in this current context, I think creates the risk of being left behind. And you see this even in investment decisions being made by big institutional investors now, that they look at ESG performance, that they look at triple bottom line performance. So I'm not sure that the pandemic added something, although the pandemic to me is the great amplifier. It amplified, for example, many of our inequities and inequalities, right? I'm here in my home office, I'm well off, but someone who has to take daily public transport to get to their job and be surrounded by others, their risk factor is much higher. So perhaps the pandemic made it even less unavoidable for companies to be thinking about that, but we'll see about that. In general, independent of the pandemic, I believe that the triple bottom line and ESG, when I talked about these concepts 15 years ago, students simply wasn't relevant, didn't resonate with them. Now, I don't need to convince students anymore that social performance and environmental performance are important. And the next black elephant, it will not be a black swan. The next black elephant that's happening already is climate change. Right? And we all know it. It's the elephant in the room. We're just not doing much about it. So when it really hits us, and it is hitting us, then it becomes the black swan. It's not. That certainly is not a black swan. We've been talking about climate change for long enough. Companies are part of the society. The society is affected. Companies need to deal with that.
Ingo, thank you so much. Before I close, I'll ask this question, which I ask every guest. Books that you would recommend for people to read?
And another contextual question, because I need to know your interests, Suyash,
Well,
and the others.
from a leader's perspective,
Yeah,
given the current situation, I'm sure Black Swan, of course, is number one on there. But
it's not an easy read.
yeah,
Read. So in general, read something that don't read things because I recommended them. Read something that challenges you, to think differently. Read fiction, not just nonfiction. I think it's really important. Books that I could recommend. I'm trying to weasel my way out of this question, right? You see, anything. One podcast. It's not just books, right? So reading. I believe in books. I have a big bookshelf, right? But podcasts. One podcast that I would recommend is the Knowledge Project. It's by Shane Parrish from Farnham Street Blog, Canadian, also from Ottawa. And he has some amazing interviews that really give you different perspectives. It's varied. It's super interesting. And I listen to them to just get new ideas. And that's actually where I heard that interview with Toby Lütke from Shopify. Books. Oh, I wish I could think about this longer and send you a list. Read things that challenge you, and read some fiction too. Fiction is important.
Absolutely. And if you do think of some books later, or podcasts for that matter, please do share, because post this, we share an email with everyone with learnings from this session. So we would be happy to include that list.
Yeah, I can send you an annotated resource list on resources dealing with complexity and leadership, because that's a topic that's dear to my heart. I've invested the past 11 years on this. And it's a topic that most people haven't heard of. So I'll share that with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ingo. I mean, it has truly been an honor having you today. And I know that all of us who were in this session will have emerged wiser. And I know that the learnings from this session have been immense. For everyone who attended today, we learned about Black Swan events. We learned about how, as leaders, we maybe can't be ready for Black Swan events, and maybe we just need to be okay. We need to be okay with not being in control of everything. The importance of communication in the midst of complexity, and empathy as well. We of course talked about the triple bottom line and how that has become even more important in the coming times. And in the future, we might be seeing a lot more complexity. So thank you so much again. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And thank you so much, Ingo.
It's a great pleasure, Suyash. Great seeing you again. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.